Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about educational evaluation, but we're going to talk about it in two very different ways. First, we're going to talk about charter schools. You may have heard about charter schools. I imagine some of you actually went to charter schools. We're going to talk about what a charter school is and why it's important that we evaluate it. Second, we're going to talk about teacher evaluations, because that's one of the other very critical and controversial debates within education today. Some places want to essentially measure the job that their teachers are doing and then attach that to things like tenure or pay raises or something similar. These things end up being very emotional in their discussions, and we're going to try to step back and look at the pros and cons of both and see how we could make them better, or at least understand their strengths and weaknesses. So what's a charter school? Fundamentally, a charter school is a school or set of schools that is run by a non-public organization that uses public money and accepts students from a public school area without charging them tuition. The money comes from the standard public school budget, and this is what's going to make charter schools controversial. Now, why might we like charter schools? Well, if we think that our public schools are somehow failing our students, charter schools have been put forward as one alternative. What are their advantages? Charter schools boosters point to things like they have greater flexibility in staffing. Teachers' unions aren't nearly as strong at charter schools, and so they think that they can ensure that they get the best teachers by retaining or not retaining teachers based on their performance. Second, they're just less caught up in established bureaucracies. So they're more flexible. They can do something different. They point to the way in which schools tend to get stuck in a kind of path dependence, and they're able to start again. They're able to move outside some of the standard limitations of schools. They can have longer hours, they can have different types of programs, and that allows them, in some cases, they would argue, to serve their students better than the public school system could have. So how do students gain admission to charter schools? Charter schools are funded by public money, so they can't have admission requirements that would not allow anyone within the district to enter. They're not like private schools that can ask for an admission exam or exclude certain sets of students. So how do students get in if there's more demand than there is possibilities for slots? Well, it comes down to a lottery. Interested students put their name in, and there is a lottery. If the student wins a spot, they're offered it, and they make a choice as to whether they want to follow through and go to the school. If they don't get a spot, they go to the public school that they'd be otherwise assigned. So why are charter schools controversial? Largely it comes down to their funding. Charter schools are publicly funded, as I've mentioned. That means that the money that goes to them is not going to other places, such as the standard public schools. So advocates for those standard public schools, teachers and teachers unions, often feel that the money being sent to charters could be better spent fortifying the traditional public schools. They think that while charters, in theory, are claiming that they give students an alternative for failing schools, public school advocates feel that they're actually leading to the failing schools doing worse because they no longer have the same amount of funding. Second, their pedagogical methods have come under critique. Some of the things that they have done often involve extremely rigorous, essentially retraining. There's a lot of cultural elements of charter schools that aren't possible at public schools, and some of these have been seen negatively by members of, say, critical charter school groups. I previously suggested that there's a lottery to get into charter schools, and in some ways this would be considered fair, but critics of charter schools often claim that this lottery excludes people because often people who are most needy may not know about it. Charter schools have to advertise themselves, and if people don't know, they can't enter. Charter schools want to look good, so they get their funding continued. And so we have situations in which if at least the critics of charter schools would claim that they're not advertising to students who would in theory be more difficult to educate, and who in theory might need an alternative education the most because they want to continue to look good. There is some discussion about private versus non. So why are charter schools controversial? Largely it comes down to their funding. Charter schools are publicly funded, as I've mentioned. That means that the money that goes to them is not going to other places, such as the standard public schools. So advocates for those standard public schools, teachers and teachers unions, often feel that the money being sent to charters could be better spent fortifying the traditional public schools. They think that while charters, in theory, are claiming that they give students an alternative for failing schools, public school advocates feel that they're actually leading to the failing schools doing worse because they no longer have the same amount of funding. Second, their pedagogical methods have come under critique. Some of the things that they have done often involve extremely rigorous, essentially retraining. There's a lot of cultural elements of charter schools that aren't possible at public schools, and some of these have been seen negatively by members of, say, critical charter school groups. I previously suggested that there's a lottery to get into charter schools, and in some ways this would be considered fair, but critics of charter schools often claim that this lottery excludes people because often people who are most needy may not know about it. Charter schools have to advertise themselves, and if people don't know, they can't enter. Charter schools want to look good, so they get their funding continued. And so we have situations in which if at least the critics of charter schools would claim that they're not advertising to students who would in theory be more difficult to educate, and who in theory might need an alternative education the most because they want to continue to look good. One further controversial element about charter schools is their for-profit status. Many states only allow nonprofits to run charter schools, but there are others, Michigan being one of the most notable, that allow for-profit companies to get a charter and run their own school. Michigan's important right now because, one, it has a lot of students, but two, because Betsy DeVos, current Secretary of Education for the United States, was a philanthropist from Michigan who had a lot of influence in the whole process of turning their charter schools into a system that can be run for profit. Now, these policies, of course, are becoming under more scrutiny because she's found herself in such a position of power and has continued to advocate for such approaches. Overall, however, the for-profit percentage of charter schools has been dropping over the last several years as more states have created laws that only allow nonprofits to run them. So how do we as social scientists figure out if charter schools are helping or hurting? Well, we're going to go back to the system that selects students into them. Remember I said earlier that there's a lottery? Well, that's going to be really helpful to us, because it's not just easy to make comparisons in test scores. You can imagine that parents who seek out charter schools could be different from parents who stay in the normal public schools for a number of reasons. One, they might be more academically motivated. They might think, I'm going to try hard to find the best educational opportunities for my kid. That might just indicate something about them in general, which would lead to their kid having higher test scores. Maybe the same student or the same parents who are willing to seek out better opportunities for their kids, or what they think are better opportunities, are the same ones who make sure they do their homework every night. So, this could be nothing about the charter school. This could be just about the type of people selecting into the charter school. On the other hand, we can imagine the exact opposite. We can imagine that parents who are seeking out charter schools are parents whose kids aren't doing well in the regular public schools for whatever reason. So they're looking for a change. So maybe charter schools are going to disproportionately enroll students who are struggling. And then we might see test scores that are actually lower than the public schools, even if the charter schools are doing a good job. Now, this is why the lottery is so great. We're able to make a comparison that's totally split by chance. You have a lottery. So you have a group of students overall who wanted to go to the charter school. one doesn't get in, one does. So we can say that this is random selection into the charter school. So now you're no longer comparing all the students in the charter school to the students in the public school. The comparison you're making is the students who applied to be in the charter school and got in to the students who applied to get into the charter school and didn't, and so went to other schools, generally the local public schools. Now, this is very convenient to us because it removes some of the problems that we just talked about. It doesn't remove everything, though. For instance, we can say we might figure out that charter schools have some effect on the students who wanted to go and get in versus those who don't. Would they have the same effect on the students who didn't try in the first place? Maybe or maybe not. We might think that more engaged students get more out of a different educational experience, and maybe more engaged students are more likely to apply to charters, or the complete different direction. It also doesn't tell us what it does to the public schools in general. Do the students who don't apply at all do worse than they would have if some of their peers wouldn't have left for the charter school, either because of funding or because a potentially group of academically minded peers are leaving? And so if we believe in peer effects, maybe we think the students who left behind did worse. And so it's not so much that the charter school mattered, it's just that the charter school has a full set of academically motivated students, and the public school now has a lower proportion. So it's not going to sort out those effects, but it's way better than what we can generally do. The government and the Center for Education and Statistics has been very interested in this. Obviously, the government's funding a lot of these charter schools, so they want to know if they work. They've been on ballot initiatives the last few years. In Massachusetts, just recently, there was a ballot initiative as whether they could expand the charter school system. So, they've spent a lot of effort trying to figure out whether they work or not. And do they? Well, you hopefully know already because you've done your readings. But let's talk. Fundamentally, we don't see huge differences between charter schools and non-charter schools. Test scores for students who are selected into them are really about the same as test scores for students who didn't get selected and who went to, we generally expect, the standard public schools. So academically, we don't see a big difference, on average. We do see some heterogeneity. Charter school students do better in some places than others, particularly some urban charter schools, where the local school districts are extremely low performing, do better than the local schools. Now, in other places where the public schools perform better, charter schools often do worse. So, those things balance each other out. We do see a couple of other non-test score related measures. Students were just more positive about their educational experience at charter schools, as were parents. So they feel better about their education. Is that a good reason for having the charter school system? Maybe. We might think subjective experience is one important part of education in general. Is this just because they're told this is a better alternative? We don't know. Public schools would probably say yes, that charter schools have essentially unleashed propaganda against them. But we do know that people, on average, are more happy with their charter schools than they were at the public schools if they weren't selected for the charters. Now, you might think, well, people who, in general, are not happy with the public schools are the ones who are trying to get into the charters in the first place, and that's a fair criticism. And that's one place where we really might want to be able to compare the students who never applied, the ones who might be happiest, versus the ones who did. One final point to clarify. Charter schools are different from magnet schools. People often get them confused, but charter schools, while they may have a theme, are run by an outside organization, whereas magnet schools are usually a specifically themed school within a public school system. So it's actually run by the same people that run the public school, even if the admission process is somewhat different or the overall focus of the school is somewhat specialized. So now it's your turn. If you were a policymaker, would you allow charter schools? Would you allow their expansion from what they're at now? What limits would you put on them? If you were at a charter school, what was your experience? Do you feel like you were better off there than had you stayed at your assigned public school or pursued another option? I'd love to hear your thoughts because it's one of those debates that, as you see, can be heated from both sides, but it's pretty complex in the way we can answer it. So, I hope it's something we can do in this class format. Go to the subreddit and share your thoughts.